This video is about what happened to Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Hello everybody, my name is Mia. Welcome back to my channel where I talk about history and politics. This story is about M.I.A, one of the largest telecommunication makers in the world based out of China, whose current deputy chair of the board and chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of founder Ren Zhengfei, was arrested in Vancouver because of her arrest warrant
for selling embargoed U.S. computer technology to Iran for possible military use.
2 Canadian citizens were detained 9 days later on December 10th, 2018, and placed in cells in Beijing. And they were both charged with spying, even though there was no evidence to support these claims. These two men were Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor.
Their fate has been bound to Meng since her arrest in Vancouver in 2018 at Washington's request. They were detained days later in what has been widely viewed as an act of retaliation.
For Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, 3 Christmases passed during their incarceration. 3 Stanley Cups were won. Half the provinces had already elected new premiers.
Holy Christ. I just swallowed a bee.
And the global pandemic had already struck. Everyone believed that these two men were held hostage in an attempt to exert pressure on the Canadian government to release Meng. So we're going to start with Michael Spavor. Born in 1976, Michael Spavor is a Canadian consultant who has worked extensively in North Korea. He is the director and founding member of Pike2 Cultural Exchange, an NGO that facilitates sports, cultural, tourism, and business exchanges involving North Korea. Michael Spavor was born in Toronto, Ontario, and has a degree from the University of Calgary in International Relations, focusing on the Korean Peninsula and East Asian Studies, and has studied in international trade and political science at Kangwon National University in South Korea. He is fluent in Korean, including the North Korean dialect, and French. Michael Kovrig was born on February 3rd, 1972, and is a Canadian former diplomat and geopolitical analyst and advisor working for the International Crisis Group, a transnational, independent, non-governmental organization focused on preventing and resolving deadly conflict through research and advocacy. Previously served for more than a decade as a diplomat in China and the United Nations, as a senior desk officer covering international security at Canada's Foreign Ministry in Ottawa. He has worked in several countries in roles including Strategic Communications Specialist for the UN Development Group. Michael Kovrig has a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University. He is an expert in Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific geopolitics and security,
China,
US and EU foreign policy on China and Asia, and he is fluent in Chinese and French.
I'm going to do a timeline of events from 2007 to 2022 so we can do a deep dive into this case of hostage diplomacy.
So first we're going to go back to the early 2000s.
February 2007, Skycom is owned by a subsidiary of M.I.A, M.I.A Management.
We're going to talk about a company called Skycom. Skycom is owned by M.I.A, which is Meng Wanzhou's company. So as of February 2007, Skycom was owned by a subsidiary of M.I.A Technologies called M.I.A Management.
November 2007, M.I.A Management transfers its shares to another M.I.A subsidiary, Canicula Holdings.
And lo and behold, Meng was the secretary of M.I.A. So the theme here is that Meng Wanzhou is deeply ingrained in M.I.A, Canicula, M.I.A, and Skycom, which are all subsidiaries of M.I.A.
February 2008 to April 2009, Meng Wanzhou serves as board of directors of Skycom.
Meng joined Skycom's board of directors, and all of the employees that work at Skycom are M.I.A employees. All significant Skycom business dealings were made through M.I.A. Everything was approved through M.I.A. Skycom's head of the business was also a M.I.A employee.
2010 to 2014, Skycom, aka M.I.A, conducts $100 million worth of transactions through HSBC, some of which was used in Iran in violation of US law.
Now we're going to go to the 2010s. So between December 2012 and January 2013, through various news organizations, it was reported that Skycom offered to sell embargoed U.S. equipment to Iran in a violation of U.S. export controls law. Huawei claimed that Skycom was just a major local partner, one of its business partners in Iran, and that they had nothing to do with each other, and that they didn't break any laws within the UN, the EU, or within the United States.
January 2013, Reuters article reports on M.I.A.'s connection to Skycom.
In January 2013, it was revealed that Meng Wanzhou had served on the board of directors at Skycom between February 2008 and April 2009, and they also identified all the other connections of Skycom to Huawei. This is a statement from Huawei. Quote, "The relationship between Huawei and Skycom is a normal business partnership. Huawei has established a trade compliance system which is in line with industry best practices, and our business in Iran is in full compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, including those of the UN. We also require our partners, such as Skycom, to make the same commitments." End quote. This statement was incorrect, as Huawei operated and controlled Skycom. Therefore, Skycom was not Huawei's business partner. So after all of these allegations came to light that Skycom was doing illegal dealings with Iran, obviously these global institutions were concerned about the business dealings with Skycom, so they requested a meeting with Huawei.
August 2013. M.I.A. meets with senior employee at HSBC and presents the PowerPoint, denying her connection to Skycom and any wrongdoing.
In Hong Kong on August 22nd, 2013, Meng Wanzhou met with an executive of HSBC. During that meeting, Meng delivered a PowerPoint presentation, and this is where the famous PowerPoint comes in, the smoking gun of the case. I found the PowerPoint online. Huawei employees, mainly Meng Wanzhou, represented to the financial institutions that Skycom was just a local business partner of Huawei in Iran, and that Skycom had not conducted Iran-related transaction using its accounts at the financial institutions, mainly HSBC. It would have been pertinent information for HSBC to know that Skycom was owned by Huawei in order to continue their business dealings, because they were doing sanctioned deals with Iran by selling embargoed US computer technology. Meng Wanzhou also claimed that Huawei had sold all of its shares in Skycom, referring back to the 2008 deal where Huaying sold its shares to Canicula, but Canicula was also owned by Huawei and Meng worked for the board of directors. So this also would have been pertinent for HSBC to know that they still controlled the company and that Skycom was only transferred from one Huawei-controlled entity to another. Meng also stated that Huawei did not violate any export control regulations or any third party that Huawei works with, when in reality, their Iran-based businesses were in violation of the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Controls, Iranian transactions, and sanctions regulations. Between 2010 and 2014, Huawei caused Skycom to conduct approximately $100 million worth of US dollar transactions through HSBC that cleared through the United States, at least some of which support its work in Iran in violation of US law. After the meeting and the infamous PowerPoint, HSBC decided to continue its relationship with Huawei. The other global financial institutions similarly continued their respective relationships with her.
August 2018. A New York court files an arrest warrant for M.I.A. to stand trial in the United States.
With the U.S. sanctions on Iran, no company is allowed to sell certain equipment from U.S. companies to Iran. The U.S. accused Huawei of using an unofficial subsidiary called Skycom Tech to obtain the prohibited goods. The U.S. claims that the true nature of Skycom was that of a front to hide Huawei's activities in Iran. If this is true, they allege that M.I.A. knowingly misled the bank, putting the bank at risk of violating sanctions against Iran. A New York court filed an arrest warrant for Meng Wanzhou to stand trial in the United States.
December 1st, 2018. M.I.A. is arrested by the RCMP in Vancouver while transferring planes from Hong Kong to her destination in Mexico.
She was arrested by RCMP in Vancouver at the request of the U.S., pursuant to the extradition treaty between the United States and Canada.
All stories have a beginning. This one starts at the Vancouver airport in December of 2018, when Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou was detained and placed in a BC detention center after an extradition request from the U.S. U.S. prosecutors alleged she committed fraud and lied to a Hong Kong banker so her company could work around U.S. sanctions on Iran.
M.I.A was under house arrest in Vancouver and underwent extradition hearings to the United States throughout her entire time spent here, which was nearly 3 years. I just want to say that she lived in her Vancouver mansion under house arrest for 3 years and dressed incredibly well while she did it. She's giving Elle Woods.
Fashion.
Also, it reminded me of this.
but add house arrest.
On the 28th of January 2019, the U.S. Department of Justice formally announced financial fraud charges against M.I.A. The first stage of the extradition hearing for M.I.A. began Monday, the 20th of January 2020, and concluded on the 27th of May 2020, when a BC court ordered the extradition to proceed. On the 13th of February 2020, M.I.A. was personally indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice on charges of trade secrets theft. During the extradition courtroom proceedings, M.I.A.'s lawyers made several allegations against the prosecution, including allegations of unlawful detention of M.I.A., unlawful search and seizure, extradition law violations, misrepresentation, international law violation, and fabricated testimonies by the CBSA, each of which were responded by the prosecution.
December 9th, 2018. Canadian citizens Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig are detained by Chinese officials and charged with espionage.
In December 2018, while he was living and working in Dandong on the Chinese side of the China-North Korea border, Spavor was taken into custody along with Michael Kovrig by Chinese officials. The arrest was widely interpreted as retaliation for Canada's arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou.
10 days later, China detained Michael Kovrig, a former diplomat who had previously met with Chinese dissidents, and Michael Spavor, a business consultant who arranged travel into North Korea. China said both men were spies.
This has our attention at the very highest levels of our government.
That attention quickly turned to legal action in both China and Canada. Meng was given an ankle bracelet.
We don't need no sleep because the party don't stop. So put your hands on me and turn me on, turn me up. We don't need no sleep because the party don't stop. So put your hands on me and turn me on.
And confined to her Vancouver mansion while she fought extradition. The two Michaels were imprisoned in China. Canadian officials were given limited access to them.
China denied that the arrests were made in retaliation, but has linked the events by suggesting the Canadians could be released if M.I.A. were freed.
China has long denied accusations of hostage diplomacy, but a former senior government official who worked on China issues says the timeline is proof of an admission.
I think what they're doing is signaling to other countries that if they run into challenges with China, this might happen to their citizens as well. In the Chinese, there's an old idiom that says, kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. And in this case, Canada was the chicken.
By the way, the men were arrested 9 days after M.I.A. was detained in Vancouver, and they were released 1 day after M.I.A. was released in September of 2021. So I don't know how they can make it more obvious that they were conducting a game of hostage diplomacy. There were protests from both sides to release Meng Wanzhou and also to bring the two Michaels home. Two people who demonstrated in support of Meng Wanzhou outside BC Supreme Court during her extradition hearing say they were unwittingly recruited under false pretenses and paid to be there. A young Canadian actor named Julia Hackstaff from Vancouver was promised $100 for 2 hours of work in what she understood to be an appearance as an extra in a movie. Another person was recruited by a friend promising a $150 payday just to show up at the courthouse and hold a sign. Quote, I was told it was to free Miss M.I.A. I had never heard that name before in my life. I had to go after and Google what Huawei was because I had never heard that name before in my life. I didn't even know it was a company. End quote.
August 2021. Michael Spavor is sentenced to 11 years in prison for espionage after already serving almost 3 years.
5 months later, Spaver was convicted of spying and sentenced to 11 years plus deportation.
Canada condemns in the strongest possible terms Mr. Spavor's unjust conviction after more than 2.5 years of arbitrary detention.
China alleged that Spaver had taken photos and videos of military equipment and may have provided them to Kovrig. Against international law, the men were not allowed to be seen by lawyers or Canadian diplomats or their families or give us any information on their welfare to ensure that they were safe. When this was going on, I remember listening to the radio a lot during those years when they were incarcerated, and a lot of us believed that they were dead because we hadn't heard from them in almost a year at one point. So a lot of us believed that they would never come home because that's a track record for the People's Republic of China.
On his 1,000th day of detention, Spaver's family marched 7,000 steps.
We hoped we wouldn't have to be here, or certainly not in the same situation. But we're here.
From the reporting of journalists, we know that the men had no access to lawyers or family, were held in cells without daylight, with lights kept on around the clock, and endured interrogation sessions that lasted up to 8 hours. As time passed, there were some small concessions with consular visits at which books were provided and some news passed on, but the conversations were monitored and the men's letters were censored. Apparently the men suffered, quote, dissociation from humanity. When Michael Kovrig received his first sanctioned visit after 10 months in October of 2020, he was unaware that the COVID-19 pandemic had even begun. There were no exercise yards or dining halls. The cells were tiny. Toilets were a hole in the floor. Meals were broth or boiled vegetables. The men were believed to have been subject to torture, sleep deprivation, and solitary confinement. It has been said that the sentencing of Michael Spaver to 11 years for alleged espionage is arbitrary, unsubstantiated, and politically motivated, which ironically enough is what the Chinese government said about Canada's detention of Meng Wanzhou. They accuse us of being puppets of the US's empire. Now this is an interview from a Chinese consulate member in Vancouver at the time. From the very beginning, China has repeatedly pointed out that the case of Meng Wanzhou is purely a political incident. The United States government's request for the extradition of Meng Wanzhou from Canada is in essence an abuse of legal procedures to suppress Chinese high-tech companies and obstruct the development of Chinese science and technology. China will never accept any form of political coercion or abuse of justice, and will never allow Chinese citizens to become victims of political persecution of another country. Any attempt to bully or oppress the Chinese people will inevitably be met with strong fightback. Canada has played as an accomplice for the United States' political persecution against a Chinese citizen and aroused strong indignation from the Chinese people. The nature of the two Canadian citizens' cases is completely different from the Meng Wanzhou incident. The two Canadians were arrested and prosecuted in accordance with the law for suspected crimes of endangering China's national security, while Meng Wanzhou has been arbitrarily detained for over 1,000 days while she did nothing that violates the Canadian law. Meng's detention is a political incident concocted by the United States, and Canada has acted as an accomplice. Michael Spaver was prosecuted and found guilty of secretly gathering state secrets and illegally providing state secrets to foreign forces. The Canadian side's unwarranted remarks on the verdicts of the two Canadians by the Chinese courts are gross interference in China's judicial sovereignty and serious violation of the basic norms of international relations and international law. Canada's accusations against China are unreasonable, absurd, and arrogant. We express indignation and strong condemnation over this.
September 24th, 2021. The Department of Justice reaches a deal with Meng by deferring their criminal charges and withdrawing their extradition request after she entered into a DPA.
At a courthouse in New York City, as well as a courthouse here in Vancouver.
I'd like to thank the Honorable Associate Chief Justice Holmes for her fairness in the whole legal proceedings. I also appreciate the Crown for their professionalism and the Canadian government for upholding the rule of law.
Huawei's chief financial officer spoke in front of the Vancouver courthouse where a judge ended her extradition case. The ruling came just hours after the request for her extradition was withdrawn in a U.S. court. Just before that, Meng Wanzhou had been arraigned on and pleaded not guilty to several fraud and conspiracy charges.
On the 24th of September 2021, the Department of Justice announced that it had reached a deal with Meng to resolve their case against her by deferring their criminal charges and withdrawing their extradition request after she entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with them.
Meng was accused of violating U.S. sanctions against Iran. The deal allows Meng to deny guilt for key charges, but leaves room for the U.S. to continue to pursue its case against Huawei.
The client gets to go home to her family.
Lawyers on both sides said very little about how the deal was reached. In a statement after Friday's back-to-back decisions, Canada's Department of Justice said Canada is a rule of law country. Meng Wanzhou was afforded a fair process before the courts. Meng Wanzhou appeared by video at this federal courthouse in Brooklyn, where she entered into the deferred prosecution agreement. Here's what it said.
As part of the deal, Meng agreed to a statement of facts, admitting that she had made untrue statements about Huawei, concealing its links to Skycom and operating it in violation of U.S. sanctions against Iran, but was allowed to formally deny her key charges and did not have to pay a fine. The Department of Justice said that it would move to dismiss all the charges against Meng when the deferral period ends on the 21st of December 2022. On the condition that Meng is not charged with a crime before then. Meng left Vancouver on the same day aboard a Chinese government-arranged Air China charter flight after spending more than 1,000 days under house arrest in the city as part of her bail condition. She arrived and was greeted to a hero's welcome at the Shenzhen International Airport on the 25th of September 2021.
September 24th, 2021. Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig are released after Meng's deferred prosecution agreement with the United States.
Right now, this Friday night, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are on a plane and they're coming home.
After 1,020 days in Chinese detention, there will not be a day 1,021.
These two men have been through an unbelievably difficult situation, but it is inspiring and it is good news for all of us that they are on their way home to their families.
The Michaels boarded a plane around 7:30 Eastern Time, at roughly the same time that Meng Wanzhou was flying away from Canada.
Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were released after 1,019 days, which is 2.79 years, just shy of 3 years.
A reunion 1,020 days in the making. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are now home. The two Canadians embraced by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau after touching down in Spavor's hometown of Calgary. Kovrig then continued on to Toronto, where he was greeted by his loved ones on the tarmac of Pearson Airport, ending nearly 3 years of isolation in Chinese detention.
How are you feeling, Michael?
The men boarded their flight to freedom at roughly the same time Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou left Canada to fly home to China. Her arrival, live streamed by state TV, was met with a cheering crowd of flag-waving supporters. I have finally returned to the warm embrace of the motherland, she said. Hours earlier, Meng reached a plea agreement with U.S. prosecutors, paving the way for the extradition case to be dropped and for the Michaels to be released.
The timing of their release, this agreement being done within minutes, hours of Meng Wanzhou securing her agreement with U.S. prosecutors and being allowed to leave Canada after the extradition request was dropped, just proves to the critics of China that this was in fact hostage diplomacy. China had argued all along that the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor was not connected to the Meng arrest. The events of today really show that to not be true.
December 2022. A judge dismisses the charges against Meng Wanzhou.
On the 1st of December 2022, prosecution asked the judge to dismiss bank fraud and other charges against her, and the judge dismissed the charges. Biden came to visit my city, the capital of Canada, Ottawa, a couple weeks ago, and Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were invited to his parliamentary address and also to a gala afterwards at the Space and Aviation Museum. And here's a clip of him thanking them for their resilience and courage.
Our citizens are not bargaining chips. They're not diplomatic leverage. They're human beings with lives and families that must be respected. And I'm very glad to see the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. They're safely back to their families. after more than 1,000 days. 1,000 days in detention. If my mother were here, she'd say, God bless you both. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for having the opportunity to meet you earlier.
As for Mung, she had some words for Canadians.
I'm also grateful to Canadian people and the media friends for your tolerance. Sorry for the inconvenience caused.
That's all I have for this one. Thanks for sticking around with me. I will see you in the next video where I will be wearing yellow, so stay tuned. Please don't forget to subscribe and like and leave a comment about what you want me to talk about in future videos. I'm very excited to talk to you guys about more stuff. I'm having a great time. Take care of yourselves, compliment somebody, tell your mother that you love her, and tip your server.